Hello and welcome to this video on internal sources of finance. Let's consider you are starting a business. Now in order to start a business, you're going to need to buy a premises, you're going to need to employ some staff, buy some stock. Essentially you're going to need some money to get started. Well, where's that money going to come from? Well, you might badger your parents. Maybe you'd sell something that you already own. Perhaps you might pay these guys a visit. Or if you're really desperate, crack open some of your piggy banks. Ultimately, you need some money if you're going to get started or expand your business. And we call that sources of finance. Sources of finance are the options available to a business when seeking to raise funds to support future business actions. For a startup, that might be generating money to establish the business, or for an existing business, it might be to fund growing the business or maybe introducing a new strategy like relocating to a different premises. In this video, we're going to look at internal sources of finance, and in particular personal savings, retained profit and asset sales. When considering sources of finance, there are two broad categories: internal and external. Internal sources of finance are funds from within the business, whereas external are funds that come from outside of the business. In this video, we're focusing on internal sources of finance. Finance are funds that come from within the business. Let's start to work through our three types of internal finance. The first one is owner's capital, or personal sources. And that's when an entrepreneur invests their own money in a business. And owner's capital is how much the owner has invested in the business. So owner's capital shows us the proportion of what the business owns, the assets, that are owned by the business owner rather than paid for by an external source. And remembering here that assets are items owned by the business and creditors are people who have lent the business money. Typically, entrepreneurs might source this from cash savings they have or investments they've made previously. Perhaps if they've been made redundant, many entrepreneurs use that as an opportunity to set up a business. Inheritances, personal credit cards, or maybe taking out a big loan against their house and then using that money to start a business. For example, the entrepreneur who set up this business used earnings they'd received from a previous job as a management consultant to start their startup. So what's good and bad? Well, the benefits of using your own savings: you don't have to repay anyone, there are no interest charges, you maintain control of the business. Can be motivational because you've really got your own money on the line, so you're going to try hard, and there's no lengthy application procedures. On the downside, you might only have a limited amount, so it also might threaten maybe your personal finances, or if you have a family and you're remortgaging, then personally it might have an effect on them. Let's move on now to retained profits. Retained profits are profits kept within a business from profit for the year, a key term you might want to look up, and that helps finance future activities. So this is important and significant for businesses that are established and have been running for a while, so they do have previous profits that they can retain, keep, and then use to fund any future projects or expansion. So for example, if a business made a profit in year one of £10,000, they could use that retained profit to fund maybe buying a new factory for £10,000 in year two. The benefits: it's relatively cheap. Although it's not free, there is an opportunity cost. What could you have done instead with that profit? Perhaps you could have paid it out to shareholders. It's very flexible in that management can control how much is reinvested. Shareholders can have an opinion on what the proportion that should be used. And again, it doesn't change the ownership of the company because it's coming from profits made previously. It's not about changing the ownership of the business. Downsides: well, there might be a danger that you hoard cash, try and retain and keep hold of lots of profits rather than using it. And secondly, shareholders might prefer dividends rather than actually using that money to reinvest and retain it within the business. The final internal source of finance is sale of assets. And this involves selling items of value that are owned by the business. And normally here we're not talking about kind of stock or anything like that. We're normally talking about non-current or fixed assets. So assets that are likely to stay in the business for a long period of time, machinery, vehicles, those kinds of things. So these assets can be sold in order to get an immediate injection of cash and then provide finance that could be used for an alternative purpose. So for example, if a business had an old factory that they weren't using anymore, they might consider selling it. Would you sell your main assets? No, probably not. But if you had a spare asset or one that was being underutilized, then possibly selling it and using that finance to fund something else would be a sensible suggestion. Again, the benefits: no interest charges, you don't have to pay anything back. If the asset is obsolete, not being used or out of date, then it might as well sell it and use that finance. Often it can be quite a large lump sum and it's an immediate cash injection. However, if you decide later on you know what, we didn't need that factory or we didn't need those vans and you've sold them, then you might have to lease them, rent them back in the future, so it could cost you in the long run. You're not able to use that asset in the future, and this is really only a one-off option. You can only sell an asset once. So for example here, this supermarket chain, if you read at the bottom, they've been selling off some of their land that they had earmarked for new supermarkets to raise millions of pounds to provide an internal source of finance that they could then use for whatever purpose they wanted. So we've looked at internal sources of finance in this video, and in particular the three types at the bottom.